everybody. Welcome today. Super excited to have Brandon in. We're good friends. He is absolutely just amazing. One of the real superstars in our industry. And what Brandon focuses on is something that is completely foreign to me as far as trying to run PPC. I have a funny story, Brandon. I tell people that a good friend of mine did his own PPC, and he's like, if you'll come do this for me, I'll show you how to do PPC. And I sat down next to him with my computer, and he had his computer. And about 5 minutes in, looking at Google AdWords or whatever it is, I knew there was zero chance that I was going to do this. Just absolutely zero, because it gets so complicated. And I know that Google's constantly changing things. And it's something that, sort of like your transactions, where you definitely want an expert, running that for you, because it's so easy to spend a ton of money trying to figure it out, right? Like there's no free learning curve with paid advertising like that. So, Brandon, absolutely kind of like the marketing guy to the stars, right? Anybody in our industry is using him. And he was just telling me before we jumped on here, $15 million a year in ad spend. So certainly anybody who's spending $15 million a year knows what is going on. He's got an amazing agency, but he's going to come on today and going to talk about a lot of stuff. And he's got, I think, a little free giveaway for everybody who hangs out till the end. So Brandon, welcome, man. Thank you. I really appreciate you popping on today. And the floor is yours, my man.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'm like I said, I'm super excited to be here. We've also got a pretty small group, so please, guys, don't make me just talk to you. You
Yeah.
can talk to, that's fine, because ultimately, that's why we're here is to
Yeah.
figure things out for you guys. So there's so I guess my plan for today, I can tell you a little bit about myself, how I got into this. And then we can talk through some like key strategy pieces with PPC. Kind of the way that I've thought about this is, what are the things that are important for a business owner to know to succeed with their own PPC? Not necessarily managing it all, but assuming you're going to work with a good partner that knows all the details. There's some things that are just kind of counterintuitive about PPC that just don't work the same as other marketing channels do. And in a really common scenario is just that, like, because you don't understand it right, you think it's not working when it really is, or you end up going down a strategy that doesn't make as much sense for the channel, or whatever the case is, right? So I was like, my goal is what battle are we fighting today? It's like, it's a battle against like people not understanding how this channel works so they can make it function well for their business. Because I think I probably don't have to tell anybody PPC is a great marketing channel. You've all probably heard
Yeah.
lots of positive reviews about the marketing channel. You've also probably heard from a lot of people that have spent a lot of money and have not gotten the results that they want. So there's kind of that like polarizing nature of PPC, and one of the benefits that I get is being able to see the behind the scenes, the actual numbers, the actual emotions, the actual things that are going on behind all of these success stories or these failure stories. So I understand a little bit better than most, like how to piece together what causes success and what causes failure when it comes to PPC. So we could talk about, like, sometimes failures are just because of misaligned expectations. Sometimes failures are because of a bad strategy. There's some common mistakes that can be made, all that kind of stuff. A little bit of a little bit of history about me. I've been doing this for about 7 years. I started this business when I was a sophomore in college, studying marketing, actually. So what's a little bit weird about me is I come from the marketing space, and then I fell backwards into real estate. Not like I started in real estate and then I fell backwards into the marketing space, which seems to be most people in similar positions. I started with a generalist marketing agency where my whole goal was just to be like the best marketer in the world. I remember when I started my company, within 30 minutes, I had already cold emailed like 100 companies and told them, I don't even care what you want me to do. I don't care how much you pay me. I don't care even if you pay me. I just want to do marketing, and I want to become the best in the world at this. Will you let me run your marketing campaigns? And that's kind of how this company started. And it took me down a lot of crazy roads. I started working with companies like e-commerce companies, technology companies, SaaS, service companies, just all over the place. Even finding some clients spending millions of dollars per month on PPC as part of that journey, which was really interesting. But one of my first clients was actually in the real estate investment niche. If any of you know the investors here in Utah, you might know Cody Hoffine and Mark Stubler.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, they were my first clients in the real estate niche. And we've been working together for almost 7 years now, if I'm not mistaken, probably 6.5. And and that went really well. And because of that, they sent me some referrals. Those referrals sent me some referrals. At some point, I looked back at my business and I had mostly real estate investor clients without even trying to do that, and decided to cut off the rest of it and just do real estate investing marketing. So that's kind of what got us where we are today.
Nice.
So let me share my screen here and I'll show you guys a little bit of stuff. And for anybody that just joined, I gave the disclaimer that nobody wants to listen to me for an hour. So please, like, we have a small enough group. This can be interactive. You can ask questions. You can work on, like, just don't be shy, I guess is what I'm saying. Because ultimately this whole thing's here for you. So let's make sure you get what you need out of this. Um, actually, in the spirit of that, I'm curious before we get too deep into it. This is what I have on my agenda. Let's go over benchmarks because everybody has all those questions like how much money do leads cost? How good are they? What's normal? Blah, blah, blah. So I want to talk about that. And then key strategy things to go over. Like what are some PPC strategy elements that I think most business owners need to know if they're going to use the channel? But outside of that, is there anything, or even within that, like specifically, is there anything that you guys want to get out of this? Obviously, you showed up here, you're giving me an hour of your time for some reason. I imagine it's not just because you like to watch random Zoom calls about marketing channels. You probably are trying to accomplish something.
Yeah. Two questions I've got, Brandon. And it's great that you mentioned you had worked in other with other industries, but what are some of the challenging things about real estate PPC that makes it a little bit different? And then within that, like what is kind of that secret that you've discovered after running, tens of millions of dollars in ad spend for real estate companies? I'm assuming most of them are on the kind of we buy houses, wholesaler kind of, in that genre there.
100%.
But yeah,
Yeah.
what have you found that is the kind of the secret that you do that nobody else does that's given you so much success? So yeah, and I'm sure that's probably in there.
Yeah, it's well, and it's hard because here's kind of how PPC works. It works the same way that a business does, right? In
Yeah,
your business, you have your marketing, and then you have your acquisitions, and then you have your dispositions or your like project management or whatever has to do with like the monetizing the property. And if one of those works, and or even multiple of those work, but one of those doesn't work, then it's the weakest link on the chain, right? And the whole strategy breaks, right? So oftentimes people ask me like, what's like the most important piece to a strategy in PPC? And really, it
yeah,
comes down to whatever you're weakest in right now is probably the most important thing to make better. And it's like saying like the secret to a real estate investing business is getting really good at acquisitions. Like, yes, that's important, but also if you're not good at marketing and you're not good at dispositions, you're not going to work. It's not going to work. You're never not going to ever accomplish what you're looking to accomplish. So we'll talk about some of those things. I think truthfully there are a few things. Real estate investing PPC is actually the most challenging I've done, which is the reason I've kind of gravitated towards it and I really like it. And I'll explain why. Like, let's just say you're advertising like an e-commerce company or something like that. You can track easily online everything that happens and understand if you're succeeding or not. When we jump into a lead gen thing, then we deal with like we're trying to generate leads, but those leads aren't all created equal. Some of them are much better leads, some of them are much worse leads, which adds a lot of complication. And all the data to know that information kind of lies into CRM, which doesn't link up super nicely to Google Ads. And then you've got this complicated situation where you're trying to generate leads, but now you're dealing with cash conversion cycles, and it takes some time. There's different lead quality issues, and there's different perceptions of lead quality issues. And it's all a little bit of a mess, and we're dealing with so little data. Think about another industry where you could have a good business functioning off of 10 customers per month. That's not a common thing. We have to realize how rare, and it's a good thing, right? It's ultimately a good thing that you could have an awesome real estate investing business doing 10 deals per month. But think about what challenges that gives you for data sparsity. What if we're using thousands of keywords, and what if we're testing a bunch of different ad copy, and what if we're doing the different landing pages and stuff like that? It's insane how low the data volume is in this industry. So I think that's what makes a lot of people in this industry just really emotion driven with they're making decisions, because ultimately there very rarely is enough data to make really data driven decisions. That's the other thing that's really complicated about this industry. And then the last thing I would share is that the difference between a seller and a motivated seller is not that clear in Google's eyes. That's one of the biggest challenges that we face in terms of targeting, because at the end of the day, like Google just wants to get you whatever you want, and but they just don't know the difference. It's fine. It's like Google's trying to sort fruit, and it just throws the tangerines and the oranges in the same bucket because it's like, oh, that's real estate stuff. When some of those are like really good motivated sellers, and some of them are, not. So to Google, intent to sell is kind of one thing, and then motivated or distressed properties, it doesn't really understand, which makes it a challenge to target. So we'll talk about how you can do some of that stuff. Hope that answers your question, David. We'll get into the secrets. Cool.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some benchmarks first. So the two most common questions that I get: how much do leads cost, and how good are they? So I just because I know everybody's wondering, so let's just do that first, and then we can talk about the other stuff. Although these are also the most loaded, most difficult to answer questions that I could possibly come up with. So let me just give you the best information that I can. So it'd be easy for me to say how much do leads cost, and just say our average cost per lead is $220, which is true, or it's very close to there. But that doesn't really tell us a lot of what's going on there. And the reality is it varies quite a bit. And forever I just tried to like explain that, and then I realized I'll just show you. That's probably easier. This is a graph showing distribution of lead cost. So take you back to your college or high school days, which might be, histograms aren't super common, right? So it might have been a minute since you've seen one of these. But basically the way this works is there's different buckets on the bottom here for cost per lead. And then I'm showing the number of accounts that we have that fall into each one of those buckets. And so if we look at this, what it tells us pretty simply is that the most common cost per lead is actually somewhere between $250 and $300. And that's roughly true. But there's quite a bit of variance here, right? We have some clients even below $50 per lead, and we have some or one specifically as high as $850 per lead. And this is a snapshot as of 6 months ago or something. Were you going to say something, David?
No, that's super. I'm guessing the $50 a lead person is more rural, right? Where there's less competition, and 850 is like LA or something.
That's there's a piece of it to that.
Okay.
And yeah, I wouldn't. So what you said is like, I think 85% right on, but the 15% distinction is something that sometimes people get tripped up on. So let's talk about that when we talk about markets. But yeah, these lowest cost per lead clients, this is so something that exists in PPC is there's an inverse relationship between the number of areas that you target and your cost per lead. So what that means is if you target really wide in a lot of areas, you're going to get a low cost per lead, versus if you target really narrow in fewer areas, you're going to get a higher cost per lead. That's one of the bigger things affecting this. And actually, if we look at the true reality of what's going on, it's that when you have higher budget saturation, you have a higher cost per lead. What usually happens is if you target, for example, the entire United States with a $5,000 ad budget, the reality is the number of dollars going to ads per person in your targeting is really, really low. So you have a very small footprint there, which means that you get to be kind of selective, and you're picking just the cheapest opportunities, and you're getting cheaper leads. Versus if you're targeting $5,000 into one county, that's a small county, that's going to drive your cost per lead a lot higher, because the number of dollars you're spending per person in your targeting is going to be higher. So that's a key thing that focuses. Of course, you could get your cost per lead to $1,000 on a national scale if you spent $10 million a month, right? So it's not just, it's a function of budget and of locations. And what usually happens is wider locations equals lower cost per lead, because we're assuming budget stays the same. So the other factor that affects it is, like David alluded to, like which locations are they? If we're choosing areas that are less competitive, then it might be cheaper. If we're choosing areas that are more competitive, it might be more expensive. But the place where that kind of breaks down sometimes is just because I target let's just say I chose a rural area. I just pick some county in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska. What's my cost per lead going to be? Well, if my budget saturation is really high, let's just say I throw a $3,000 a month budget into a 25,000 person county in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, I'm actually going to have a really high cost per lead, despite it being rural. However, if I were to target lots of rural areas, so I have low budget saturation and there's low competition, that's how I would get to like below a $50 cost per lead, realistically on a PPC campaign. Um, I think in general, people are a little bit too focused on cost per lead. Doesn't matter. I can tell you I've got one client here right in this 8 to 850 range that is actually really excited and has a 4 to 5x return because they closed 1 in 6 of their leads and they have great deal spreads, right? So there's we have a client like that, and then I've got someone in the $50 to $100 range that doesn't have a return on investment that's very good because they have massive contract fallout. So it's like cost per lead, ultimately, like this isn't like a measure of success as much as it's contextual, and you have to understand what kind of business do you want to run and how is this going to fit into there and what's going to be the strategy. But really common is anywhere from like $50 to $150 for these national types of strategies, which I know in your real estate business was what you were doing, David,
Yeah.
where you're targeting lots of different markets. And it depends on how many markets exactly, and it also depends on how wide around those markets you target. Like if we're targeting the entire state versus just the core metro areas in that market, those are going to be a different outcome in terms of the cost per lead. And then for single markets, this whole 200 up to $400 range is very common. And then as we start to get more expensive here, we're talking about more expensive single markets. And we're talking about really small single markets, especially, or markets where we have a really high saturation of the market because we're really high on budget or something like that. To give some examples of this, like David, you gave the example of LA. Like LA
Yeah.
must be like super expensive. I can tell you LA is cheaper with, let's just say you're going to spend a $10,000 a month budget. You'll get a lower cost per lead in LA than you will in Richmond, Virginia, more likely
Really?
than not, which surprises people because they're like, well, LA is super competitive, Richmond's not. But it's about budget saturation. $10,000 is a drop in the bucket in LA. In Richmond, you're a bigger player, and you're probably going to hit some diminishing returns because of that. And it's a small market. So a lot of our clients with the highest cost per lead are in pretty small markets, which is interesting because if you look at like a tiny market and you look at it from a cold call standpoint, from a direct mail standpoint, usually the smaller the market gets, the more attractive the marketing metrics look.
Mhm.
Versus if you look with PPC, usually the smaller the market gets, the less attractive the marketing metrics look. So there's something going on with PPC where it loves population. It loves volume to work with. And that doesn't mean that small markets are a problem. But if you're in a really tiny market, you might want to think about targeting wide around it, targeting multiple markets of that size. Because at the end of the day, as long as you can avoid a really strong budget saturation, then you could have a decent cost per lead in a smaller market. You just have to either have a small budget or you have to target like you could target all the small markets in the United States and you could have a killer campaign as an example. And it would end up really cheap. So it's not small markets that are the problem as much as high budget saturation. You'd have the same problem if you targeted massive markets with even more massive budgets. But people just generally don't do that as often as they do put a medium-sized budget into a small market.
So is it more that, in LA, when you're dropping 10,000, there are so many people for Google to put your ad in front of, whereas Richmond, Virginia, there's just less bodies?
Yeah, think of it like this. So let's just say my whole business operated on an MLS offer strategy.
Uh,
Just give you a simple thing. Like let's just say I take houses on the MLS and then I just offer something at a percentage of the ARV and then I see like, can I get it accepted? And my goal was I just need one deal this month. I'm only going to do one house. If I was going to offer on 10 houses, at what percentage of ARV would I have to submit the offer in order to get one of the 10? The answer is probably like 90%, something like that. If I were to submit an offer on every single house in the United States on the MLS at some percentage of ARV, and I just needed one to get accepted, what percentage of ARV could I submit that offer at? Probably like 30%, 40%, like really, really low because I've got so many at bats there. I only need 0.01% of the people to actually accept my offer. So my
gotcha.
offer can be really low. It's the same deal where you're doing PPC. If your budget saturation is really high, then what happens is you have to get that click because you can't afford to not get it because there's finite opportunities, right? And then the cost gets bid up. Versus if you're really wide geographically or you're in a really large market, there's going to be some clicks that come by for the right price for you. And if you bid lower and you miss some clicks, it's fine because there's plenty available. So the key concept is that you can bid lower. It's
Mhm.
called PPC, pay-per-click marketing. You're bidding on a per-click basis. You can
Right.
bid low if you have a lot of ad inventory that you're targeting. Does that make sense to
Yeah,
everybody,
absolutely.
more or less?
Yeah, no, it does.
Yeah, and hence the law of diminishing returns is super clear on PPC, right? Because as you spend more money in a market, you just have to bid higher and higher and higher, and that's why you get a diminished return. Um, and plenty of companies will do that at a diminished return and play the volume game, or you can kind of play with the smaller budget and play the efficiency game. There's totally different ways to go about it. Zach, you said, how about Chicago? Um, that would fall under like a Chicago's interesting because there's less competition because of the difficulty of wholesaling in the state based on the laws, which could bring the cost per lead down a little bit. It's also a large market, which helps you, but at the same time, it is competitive still. So yeah, I'd have to look at like where exactly we stand, but like it would be, I would treat it like a standard single market, probably somewhere between $200 and $400 per lead would be like normal for a market like Chicago, for example.
Hmm.
All right.
Cool.
Any questions on cost per lead? I know I just like you probably just wanted to know $220 is our average cost per lead, and I just went like 5 steps.
No, I think it's important to understand, what causes that to fluctuate, and why one guy on Facebook is saying I'm at $103 per lead, and somebody else is, well, I'm at 300. What's my guy screwing me?
Yeah, that's that, and that happens all the time. I tell my team all the time. Every joke starts with two real estate investors walk into a bar and talk about their
Sure.
PPC.
Yeah.
You just never know what's going to come out of that conversation, because like everybody measures this differently, right? Like I've had some people we talk to about cost per lead, and then later on they're like, "But my cost per lead was $600," but really they were measuring cost per opportunity because they said, "Well, those ones weren't good leads," or something, right? So like there's different layers of lead quality that factor into it, and then it
Yeah.
fluctuates over time. Here's the reality of the situation: like, don't go to a PPC company and ask them what your cost per lead is going to be because they don't know, and
Yeah.
you're just going to be pressuring them into guessing, and then you're just relying on the optimism of your salesperson as to like what they think. So it blows my mind how many people will like just go to a few agencies and ask them what cost per lead they'll get, and then just go with like the lowest cost per lead that they get like quoted. When the reality is nobody can tell you what your cost per lead is going to be until you get like you get your dialed in location targeting, exactly how you're going to do it. You figure out how that impacts with your budget, you get some data, and then you know what it's going to be. A good PPC company should know that there's no like real truth to this, but this helps us understand generally what to expect and how it varies. And just don't be too afraid of it. Like we have some clients where they end up with a much higher cost per lead than they expected,
Yeah.
and it still works. And sometimes it's cheaper than we want. The other thing is lead quality is a really big factor of this. So there's some things that I can do to lower your cost per lead that don't benefit you. Like keywords, for example. There are different keywords that we could target that have a higher lead quality and certain keywords that have a lower lead quality. And the way that we target that and how much we spend on each of those different groups will dramatically affect the cost per lead. So you don't want to, if you focus too much on cost per lead, what you can do without realizing it is push your agency into doing something that's not actually in your best interest. Just saying, all I want is for my lead cost to be $200, and then you'll get that, but you all your leads are going to be from people searching for open door or for the value of their house or something like that, and that might not actually be what you want. Cool. Any other questions on cost per lead before we talk about quality? Cool.
Uh,
All right. So in the spirit of giving way too much information, again, when it comes to lead quality, let's talk about what's normal. So these are percentiles across our clients for leads per contract. So the way that this works is, 10th percentile is going to be among our worst closers that we work with. These are adjusted for the quality from different ad groups and stuff like that, and verify that like the strategy is similar across all the accounts included in this, in this study. So what this shows essentially is, obviously it depends on your acquisitions team performance. If you're going to be a typical acquisitions team, you're going to perform at about 15.2 leads per contract. That's our 50th percentile. If you kill it, you'll be at 8 leads per contract. That's 90th percentile. Our top 10% of clients are doing that or better. And 24 might be if you're not doing so well. And first percentile might be like 100 leads per contract or something like that. So this gives you some idea of like what a typical spread is. Obviously, there's a lot of factors on your side that depends on. It also depends on lead quality benchmarks. Like a poorly run PPC campaign can produce a lot of really bad quality leads, and that could like affect this, right? So these are the numbers across our clients. Here's what I've noticed generally about these numbers. We're the only company that I know of that actually tracks all this stuff closed loop and provides like verified average data. Most companies just kind of think, oh, there's these 3 clients that I all talk to that said they have this many leads per contract, and we're just going to say that that's normal. The reality of that is usually it skews towards positive. So what you'll hear from a lot of companies is that they generally expect from PPC about 15 leads per contract. However, they're being optimistic and we're being realistic when we say that. And our clients generally, when they switch from those other companies to us, they get less leads per contract because we focus so heavily on quality. But we just give actual average numbers, and other companies, if they gave actual average numbers, would look a lot worse than these average numbers, if that makes sense. So that's the easiest way I know to communicate quality. Does anybody have any questions about this, or does this bring up any thoughts or comments?
No, no, I got a couple questions, but I think you're probably going to touch on them here in a minute. So I'll hang on for just a minute.
Yeah, we'll see what I'm going to touch on. I haven't seen this deck for a second, so hold on. Here we go. Locations. Now, were your questions kind of along these lines, David, or was it more on lead quality?
Yeah, a little bit, just kind of a comparison because you've been doing this for so many years and for, large and small companies, but, just maybe strategies from some of your clients who are, do the nationwide versus like select markets, not necessarily one market, but like when I was doing PPC, I was running like 28 markets. And that's felt like a nice happy medium for me, but, what do you really see as that kind of successful strategy, or of the people who are absolutely just really crushing it?
Let me see if I can pull up an additional analysis here. So I'm going to snag a oops, sorry guys. What was I looking for? All right. So here's some additional benchmarks, kind of speaking to the national model.
Yeah.
So this is the best graph we have of the relationship between your cost per lead and the number of markets that you target. As you can see here, for a single market, about $325 per lead is kind of normal, and then as high as 500, as low as 160 or so, being sort of the error. And then as we add markets, this is what happens to our cost per lead. It goes down, down, down more quickly at first, and then as you go further here, it continues to go down and continues to get pretty low as you get closer to 200 markets. So this is the general relationship that we're looking at. So what a lot of people are after is return on investment. Return on investment is a metric made up of 2 different metrics. Number 1, what is your cost per lead? And then number 2, what is your revenue per lead? So revenue per lead obviously being a function of how well do you close those leads, how many of them fall out of contract, and then how large are the deals when they do close. So what happens when you go to a national model is usually your cost per lead goes down. And then if you're really, really good, you can make it so your revenue per lead doesn't go down. And then you have a higher return on investment. Where it messes people up sometimes is their cost per lead goes down, and then the revenue per lead also goes down, maybe even more than the cost per lead does, because now they went from 25% contract fallout to 75% contract fallout because they don't know what they're finding buyers in these new markets, or their average deal spread went down significantly or something like that. So there's like real validity to a more national model, and you'll get more leads. If the question is what gets you the most leads, go wide, like really wide. But there's also validity to doing what David did, where he kind of focused on like 12 markets, for example. it gets you a higher cost per lead, but if you could be better at producing revenue from those leads in that area, then that could be the happier medium for you. And I kind of see everything in between. Like there's people who just do a single market, and then there's people who go blanket national. We'll target everything and anything. And the cost per lead looks really different. Sometimes the return on investment can vary quite a bit. Sometimes it's kind of similar. A lot of it depends on how you run your business and how much variety you're willing to deal with in terms of where your leads come from. So I've seen it work both ways, where we encourage someone to go wider geographically and it works really well for them because they get more leads. But you just have to be careful. Don't let your revenue per lead slip too much. If you go too wide, you might end up not actually closing a lot of your deals, or you might end up with much smaller spreads than you expect. And that's where it'll really bite you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And is there any difference between just doing like, a nationwide campaign or a statewide campaign, as opposed to saying, hey, I want Duval County, West, or, Palm Beach County, and I don't know, Volusia County or something, right? Like if I just pick certain counties, does that affect the price? Does Google think like, oh, you're cherry picking, we're gonna charge you just a little bit more?
Yeah. You're asking all the right questions, David, and this is going to get real complicated real
Oh,
quick.
I'm
So
sorry, man. I've run a lot of PPC and struggled
yeah.
with it a bunch. So
No, this is actually a really good thing for us to talk about, but you guys just got to buckle in and like try to understand because it gets a little bit complicated. There's no like Google saying, hey, you're selected, we're going to charge you more or something. It's all just auction, right? So if you like, we're just talking about like standard economics here, like why the price is what the price is. So there's different ways to target, and I'll highlight a few of those ways that are pretty common. Number one would be with states, where you just target an entire state. Number two would be with counties. And number three would be with radiuses. These are all ways that you can target within Google. Here's where people get taken off guard sometimes with PPC. One of the biggest problems that I see in this industry is targeting too wide. And it gets people more than they think. Like, let me just give you like a very specific example here. So let's go to Google Maps. So I'm going to search for Riverside County, California. Look at this county.
yeah,
So it includes exactly what people probably think of when they think of Riverside County, California. Inland Empire, right here, right? Like Riverside, the city, this core area close to Los Angeles. It also includes all of this. And you could get lead from Cox, California, right here.
Right.
So think about how much money as an investor you're going to make from your lead in Cox, California versus your lead in Riverside, California.
Yeah.
Now also think, do you think your competition is targeting Cox, California on the same level that they're targeting Riverside, California? The reality is the average cost per click is probably much higher in Riverside. So let's just say I come into an auction and I'm willing to pay $100 per click and I'm bidding everywhere in this county. When somebody searches in Cox, I'm probably like the highest bidder and I'm winning that auction. When somebody searches in Riverside, someone else is willing to pay more. So what happens is, as an investor, I'm like, well, 90% of the population from within this county is in the areas I like. I like Riverside County. What's the problem? But then what ends up happening with Google is I get a disproportionate number of leads from out here where nobody else wants them. And that's just Google doing its job. You're just bidding the same amount in all those circumstances, but you just happen to win those auctions where it's least competitive. And where it's least competitive tends to correlate fairly well with where it's least desirable. So that's the issue that you get if you target too wide. So as you can imagine, targeting statewide could be even more of a problem if I'm targeting the entire state of California. How often am I getting a lead in the heart of Los Angeles versus in Fort Irwin? Probably Fort Irwin more often, even though there's less population out there, because when someone does search, I'm the high bidder. So you have to be a little bit careful about it. There's different ways to do it. Like at the end of the day, like you just don't want to target with one campaign a lot of different areas that have a very different revenue per lead. So the number one, here's the way that I would handle this. Let's just say you're in one market and you know that market. You just target in that market where you know is good, right? If I'm in Phoenix, I'm probably targeting like some type of radius that covers a lot of this main stuff. Let's just say you're going national and you're targeting a lot of markets that you're less familiar with. You have to recognize that there's a real risk to targeting areas that are not your bread and butter. And there's a real risk to targeting areas that have lower populations that might not be as attractive. So there's lots of people out there who like to run statewide PPC campaigns and they get their cost per lead really low. For a lot of those people, we've been able to get them better results by moving to a different type of strategy. My favorite strategy for this is what we call satellite imagery targeting. I'll show an example of this right here.
So I did something very similar. When I first started running PPC, I said, well, let me just target where all the hedge funds are. And that had its own set of problems. But the exact same thing that you saw with Inland, I did in Buffalo, New York, with Buffalo County or whatever it's called. And like everything is right on the right on the Great Lake. And I was getting stuff 30 miles out that like one sale in a year in that town. It was horrible. So I learned pretty quick.
Yep, that happens all the time. Here's my favorite way to do this targeting is with satellite imagery. So this is a Google map overlaid with satellite imagery taken at night of the United States. So you can see here, based on these lights, these are all like houses, businesses, people, population. We go out into the middle of nowhere, it's dark because it's just a forest or whatever,
Yeah.
right? So this kind of shows like where the population is. And for a lot of people, if they're entering markets that they're not as familiar with, you kind of want to focus on where the light's brighter here, because we found that correlates really well with the ability to disposition that property. Because how a lot of people do this is they would do it based on city population. They just say, well, does the city have a lot of people? But what you don't realize is that Conyers, which is a city that is really close to Atlanta, where investors from Atlanta would buy in Conyers, might have the same population as Elberton, but Elberton has nothing around, right? So it's not about like the population of the city, the population of the county, as much as it is the area connected to a main metro that's at least of a certain population that has buyers in it, and do those buyers buy in this area? That's what really correlates with the ability to disposition. And then the other thing for you to consider when you're looking at locations is your exit strategy. Let's just say I'm novating 100% of what I get. I could probably get away with targeting like this really wide band that shows general metro Atlanta, because maybe out here in Jackson, there's plenty of retail buyer activity, but there's not very much cash buyer activity. So since I'm moving things through the retail market, I'll find a buyer. But if I'm wholesaling, on the other hand, I need areas that have sufficient cash buyer activity. So I'm probably dialing this down a little bit tighter.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing, is like people who go really wide tend to have exit strategies to match it. A recipe for failure is to wholesale only and then go really wide geographically. You'll end up with a bunch of leads in areas where you just can't find cash buyers.
That put a lot of people out of business a couple of years ago.
Yeah, because for a time, because there's this relationship, the wider you go, the lower your cost per lead. So for a time, it was a race of like who can get wider. So everybody just goes wider, and somehow buyers are still buying because the market was just insane, right? And then what happens is the market changes, buyers don't start buying just literally anything, because that buyer that was buying out in the middle of nowhere was buying there because they couldn't find any inventory in their core area.
Yeah.
Well, now they can find inventory in their core area more. So they don't want to go super wide. So now the name of the game is like you want to match your locations to your exit strategy really well. And if you do that right, then you can succeed. But if you if you end up getting a lot of leads that just won't work with your exit strategy, then you've wasted a lot of money essentially. And the really tough thing about PPC is if you got a little leak in your bucket, it could fill your whole bucket or empty your whole bucket. Because there's like if I target 9 good areas, 1 bad area, more likely than not, I'm going to get a disproportionate number of leads from the area that's least desirable amongst those to my competition, which is probably the bad area.
Brandon, that's one of the what you just said there, that last couple of minutes, that's probably one of the smartest things I've heard. That's how I used to teach dispositions was, we would go back and look at your acquisitions. And I don't hear any other marketing provider talk about that kind of stuff, right? Like when you're putting this stuff under contract, like who is going to be your buyer? What are you going to do with this thing, right? Just because you got a $4 lead is absolutely freaking worthless if there's nobody around to buy it, right? If you're in, Nebraska, and the only thing in your county is an outhouse, a cow and a frog with three legs. Like, who are you going to sell this thing to, right? Like, what is the point of running ads there? So, I think the idea to come away, hopefully this is, I'm going to say this correctly, but if we were to go out 50 miles from Atlanta, I might have $100 cost per lead, but 50% of those are going to be worthless. So I might as well just pay the $200 a lead and get the good stuff and not waste a bunch of time.
Yeah, a lot of people think very similarly to you. The one thing that you'll find is kind of unique about me, David, is I'm like, I try not to be like, this is the right way or that's the right way. It's
Yeah,
more
yeah,
like, we have clients successful doing all kinds of different things. But there's different ways to do it, because clients ask us all the time, like, what are the best locations to target? Just target those. And it's so hard because I could take something that's working for one company, plug it into your company, and it could be an epic failure because you don't have the same processes, exits,
yeah.
ways to do business.
100%. 100%.
So
Like, for me, I love PPC, but I have friends who crush it having a cold call company. I've had that same cold call company. It was an epic failure, So yeah, all of our companies we're just a little different for sure.
yeah, you have to figure that out. One of my favorite strategies right now with PPC is going heavy on novations. And the reason I love that is because if you think, what happens with PPC when you target a wider area, your cost per lead goes down. Well, what happens to which areas you're able to disposition in if you do novations instead of wholesale? Technically, there's more of them, right? So now we have the capability of targeting wider and getting a lower cost per lead. And then simultaneously, we'll probably make more revenue per deal than we would
Yeah.
have before. So our revenue per lead just went up and our cost per lead went down, which means our ROI likely grew. So you'll find a lot of the people right now that are pulling off these really lower cost per lead campaigns are doing a lot of novations, because you'll find in these more rural areas, you might find some cash buyers. And it's true that or you might find some retail buyers. It's true that some of our clients that have had the best return on investment tend to go really wide in rural, but that's also a strategy that a lot of people fall on their face trying to do. And
Yeah.
a lot of people like higher cost per lead and then higher revenue per lead instead. It just really depends on what kind of business you want to run. If you're going to be in a lot of areas, you're going to have a lot of operational headaches for a lot of like different things popping up, but you could probably pull off a higher return on investment. Versus if you just kind of find what are the right areas and you pay what you got to pay in those areas, you're going to have a smoother business that operates off of less deals, and you're making more money per deal, but your marketing expense will probably be higher. And both of those are totally valid. It's like, as the tighter you go, the harder acquisitions gets, but the
Yeah.
easier dispositions gets. Versus if
Yeah.
you go wider, dispositions gets harder, but acquisitions gets easier. So you have to know where your strengths are and kind of play to those. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Cool. There is, I think we may have just accidentally gone over a lot of what I put on here. There's one other thing on here. Primary, secondary campaigns. So let's talk about like one final location strategy that you can do that I find to be extremely successful for our clients, and almost nobody's doing this in this industry. And it's called primary, secondary campaign targeting. So just picture this continuum. Like, over here, we've got these leads have absolutely no value to me. They're in areas that I could never sell a deal, even if I had a smoking deal. And over here, we have like, this is our bread and butter. This is exactly what we want. The problem is, like, what do we do with this? We don't target it. What do we do with this? We target it, right? We all know that. What do we do about all of this in between? And that's where a lot of people have a hard time figuring out, like, where's that cutoff, right? Like, these areas are technically better than these areas, but do we target these as well? For gray area, my favorite strategy to work with it is called primary, secondary locations. And the way it works is you bid differently depending on your different areas. So remember how we talked about how your ROI is just a function of your revenue per lead divided by your cost per lead. So let's just say we have 3 counties. County 1, revenue per lead is $0. County 2, revenue per lead is $500. And then county 3, revenue per lead is $1,000. Which counties do we target? Well, we know we're not going to target county 1 because we're never going to close a deal there because there's nobody to buy them, right? So that's easy. Now we're going to focus on targeting county 2 and 3. When you're talking about strategies for doing that, some people would say, well, on PPC you want to go wide, so target both the counties. Some people would say, well, you want to focus on the best areas, so target just county 3 that has a highest revenue per lead. What I would say is you want your cost per leads to match the individual counties. So what you would do is you'd make it so in Google you're bidding, say, $200 per lead in county 3, yet you're bidding $100 per lead in county 2.
Ah,
and then you're bidding not at all in county 1. So what you're doing is you're tiering your bidding so that you're forcing it so that in county 2 and county 3, you have the same return on investment. If you put them together, what's going to end up happening is you're underpaying for leads in county 3 and you're overpaying for leads in county 2. So you're not actually hitting it right. But you have to tier it so that you're bidding just right for each one of those areas. And then you make it so that you can introduce some of these areas that maybe aren't like perfect for you, but they're right. So the strategies look different. In county 3, you're basically telling Google, I'm one of the top bidders in this area. These leads are very valuable to me. I'm willing to pay a lot of money for these leads because I know I make a lot of money from these leads. Versus in county 2, what you're telling Google is, could I do business in this area? Yes. Would I do deals? Absolutely. I'm willing to get leads, but if I buy them, I want to buy them at a discount. And that's the only way I'm willing to buy them, is at this cheap price. And what's going to happen is you're going to crush down your volume a little bit in that area, but you're also then going to get them at the right price, which is better than not having them at all, right? Because there's always some cost per lead at which it makes sense, right? People would say, I don't want that area. Well, it's just about what's the cost per lead, right? If the cost per lead were $1, would you take that area?
Sure.
For most markets, probably, right? So that's my favorite strategy, and this takes different forms. Like it could be counties, like I just mentioned. It could be that you have different, different markets around the United States that you target. Like these are tier 1 markets where we make lots of money on our deals. Many of the biggest markets, highest spread markets across the United States. But we also want to target these more secondary markets like Chattanooga, for example. But there we have to pay a lower price per lead. We just can't pay the premium that we're going to pay in LA for a lead in Chattanooga. So we do that. And by separating those out right and then bidding properly to them, you make it so that you're getting the right ROI in both of the in all the different areas. Does that make a little bit of sense
absolutely.
Cool.
I love that. And I mean, I don't know that anybody else has ever explained it like that, or any other agency that I've talked to has ever said, any of that stuff.
Yeah, it's a weird way of thinking about it, because what everybody wants to know is what's the cost per lead in these different areas, and I'll make my decision based on that. The reality is every cost per lead exists in every market. It's just at what volume can you accomplish that cost per lead. So the name of the game is you don't worry about where the market's at. You worry about where you need to be, and you bid right for your metrics, and then the rest will fall. That's the way that you win.
Nice.
Cool. All right. Any questions on location targeting before we dive into something else?
Anybody? You guys have an absolute master of PPC here. So if you have questions, drop them in the chat. We'll move on. All
right, onward. Budget.
Actually, I do have a question. Sorry, I was trying to get unmuted. Does your ad spend change per territory? Should you increase your ad spend as you expand into more territories, or should you try to keep your ad spend at a standard level and still expand territories?
I would say that how much money should we be spending and which areas should we be targeting questions are two independent questions, or don't overlap, right? So a lot of people think like, oh, if I'm targeting 50 markets, I must need more budget than if I'm targeting 2 markets. It's not true. Of course, out because there's just not enough volume available there. And then when you go to 50, now you can spend more. Like your cap is higher the more markets that you're in, or the wider you are. So that's the only time it really interacts. Like if you're looking at what's a profit maximizing budget for a national PPC campaign, it's probably like multiple $1 million per month, versus a profit maximizing budget in Chattanooga, Tennessee, likely is going to be somewhere between like $5,000 and $15,000 a month. So that's the one, like the high end could be affected. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense.
Cool. Thanks for bringing that up though, because it's a very common misconception. Like I can't target 2 markets because I don't have enough budget for those.
Yeah, that was your first, when you summed up my answer right there in your first little bit, is when you said that was a common misconception, and that was what I was roundabout asking. So it was the perfect answer.
Okay, perfect. All right, let's talk about budgets. So there's 3 costs if you're working with an agency generally to running a PPC campaign. Cost number 1, there's usually some type of nominal cost to like set up campaigns. It's not usually a ton. Usually, like with us, you'll find it's very commonly similar to whatever your management cost is each month, but just paid in advance for the setup. So that's not long-term a super big part to focus on, but it does exist. And then on a monthly basis, you're going to have two expenses. Number one is your ad spend. That's what you're going to be paying directly to Google. You want to have an agency relationship where you have your own Google Ads account and you have a direct relationship with Google through the account. What happens sometimes, there's some agencies where they'll actually own your PPC account. So if you were to ever part ways with them, then they would keep all your data. You don't want that. You don't want someone like holding that over your head. You don't want to be stuck with an agency because they won't give you your data, and it's not a good situation to be in. So ideally, you have your own account, your own direct billing relationship with Google, and then you're going to have some type of management fee. So this is what you're paying to whatever agency, whether that's Bateman Collective or any other company you work with to manage the ads. The total all-in like budget, I like to think of in a few ways. The first thing is actually timeline, which isn't what a lot of people think when they think about budget. My recommendation is usually when you're starting a new PPC campaign, you want to give it 6 months of runway. And I consider that a piece of the budget because let's just say you're spending $10,000 a month. The fact that you have to spend it over 6 months means this is a $60,000 project, which is really different than something where you're going to spend $10,000 a month for 1 month. So you want to give it some runway. The bigger the plane, the more runway it needs to take off, right? And there's a real factor here with PPC where you give it more time, that increases your likelihood of success. So 6 months is what I would be thinking if I were in your shoes. So the total cost, usually if we're talking about management fees and ad spend, for most of our clients, they start out somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000 a month all in, and then plan on an initial 6-month budget to get the campaigns off the ground and see how it works. There are some exceptions that could be a little bit lower. And of course, we have clients not usually starting, but especially over time spending into the 6 figures monthly with ad spend. But for a starting place, that's kind of normal. Any questions about just the basics of that? Okay, it's pretty simple. I can't tell if
Oh,
you
I did
guys
have
are
sorry.
shocked or if this is exactly what you expected.
So my question is, there's so many companies out there that are, trying to advertise like, oh, you spend like $100 a month. I come from the e-commerce world, from Amazon, so I know what PPC costs. So this is a lot more realistic, 5 to 15K per month. And when you say that, is that one targeted area, or is that, kind of thinking, okay, statewide? What is that more directed towards?
It's really I would say that the conversation around locations and the conversation around budgets are almost like two separate conversations, with the only overlap being sometimes if you're in a really small market, like if you come to me saying like, I really want to market Lubbock, Texas. I'm going to start out at $10,000 a month. You can't spend $10,000 a month in Lubbock, Texas. That's not going to work out because it's right. So the ceiling for the market could depend on which areas you're targeting, where maybe if you have like a really tiny market, you don't want to overfund the campaign. And then what's going to happen is you're going to find some way to pay $1,000 per lead in Lubbock, Texas, because you're trying to spend the 10 grand a month and you just have to bid insanely high on every opportunity because you can't lose to someone else bidding higher because you've got to get the volume to spend your budget. It's the only way, right? So usually that would only affect like the high end, although for a lot of markets, the high end is outside of that $5,000 to $15,000 a month range. So it's irrelevant, And if we're being really honest, sometimes if somebody's wider geographically, I would say you can get away with a little bit of a lower budget because you'll have a lower cost per lead, and that will make it so you'll get more deal volume. But that's almost it's kind of like people ask the question all the time, like how much budget do you need to get traction on campaigns? But the hard thing is, how do you define traction? Because the reality is, like, you could have a pretty small budget campaign and it wouldn't get a worse return on investment than a larger budget campaign. It would just take a long time to get there and it would be very inconsistent in the process of it. So there's no such thing as kind of a round budget for PPC. It's just there's a round expectation for a budget. Like you could spend $500 a month on PPC and after 2 years look back on it and say it's really good, but month to month you're going to feel like your PPC is not working. So a lot of like my budget recommendations are based on what the typical person needs emotionally to feel like their campaigns are working. When the reality is it could be like quote unquote working with a smaller budget. But the last consideration there is if you're going to pay a management fee to an agency, Like for us, our bare minimum management fee is $12.50 a month. If you're going to come to us with $500 a month in ad spend, we've got to work a miracle with your $500 to make it cover our $12.50. So that's the other thing that like you have to think about is at some level of budget, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. So you have so small of a budget that you can't afford to get the right talent working on the project to make it work. So then you've got to like, yeah, like nothing's going to work. So that's kind of like the bare minimum for us is, and we would only do it in really small markets, like $12.50 management, $2,000 ad spend. But the reason I say 5 to 15 is because for most people, it's a better fit to spend more.
Nice. Oh, great questions.
Yeah, thank you guys. And it looks like we are out of time. But if anybody has any final questions, I can answer something real quick. And then I'll have to wrap this up.
Yeah. Well, good
All
news.
right,
I have a whole page full of questions here, but I think we're going to speak a little bit later today, and I am I'm going to drill you with all the other questions I've got here. We'll do it. We'll do it then. So we're gonna do a little podcast, and I'm gonna hit him with all the questions. So if you guys have any other questions that you were too shy to ask here, send them over to me, and I'll certainly do it later. Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right, guys. Thank you so much for popping on, Brandon. Man, that was awesome, dude. We went deep. We talked about a lot of things. Hopefully, we opened your eyes. I have so many other questions. I'm going to ask you one last question. This is it, just one. If somebody for some reason is not using you and they're using somebody else, like what is the one question they should be asking their PPC agency to make sure that they're getting the best results?
That's a really great question. I mean, the easiest way I could answer that, we do have a audit service that's free. So let's just say you're working with another PPC agency right now. You want to make sure that you have access to your account, which you should have anyways. That's my belief that in most agencies will give it to you. There's a few out there that won't. But if you can get access to your account and then you can come to us, I put our website address here. It's batemancollective.com. Go there and you can see there's a place to like schedule a consultation with somebody on my team. That's the path, even if you just want to talk about working with us and figure out some more stuff for your specific scenario. But if you're already running a campaign, we will look at the metrics and everything for you. Like I said, there's no one thing where it's like, oh, ask them this question and see how they respond. And if they say this, then they don't know. Like, I don't know a great question like that. But what I do know you can do is you can look at the campaign. And this is true even for if you've ever run something before. In my opinion, when people are switching agencies, the number one mistake that they make is they never understand why it didn't work before. They just decide, well, that didn't work, so we're just going to do it again with someone else. And that didn't work, so we're just going to do it again. Without understanding it didn't work because of X, Y, Z. So we have to make sure the next time we try this, we're fixing that problem. It sounds really logical, but most people don't do it because the reality is it's just more complicated and it's more technical. And like, we just don't know, but you can have my team look at that and help you diagnose, like, this is the reason you didn't get the results you were looking for. And then hopefully that gives you the confidence. If we can fix this thing, then we know that we're going to get better results moving forward. So that's the best thing you could do is reach out to my team. And it's happened several times where you reach out and say, I think my agency's horrible. And we look at it and say, actually, I think your agency is doing a decent job and you're horrible. And if that's true, we'll tell you.
You don't know how to close. You couldn't close a bag with both hands. Is that what you're saying?
I guess what I'm saying is we try to be really transparent and tell the truth, whatever that is. And the last thing I want is for people to just keep on running around the different agencies without fixing rid of the problem, which could be their sales process or something like that. Like, I'm not going to tell you your leads are the problem when you're the problem. That's not the goal, at least. But of course, it's all somewhat speculative. Like, nobody can know anything for sure. But it is helpful to have somebody who has a lot of eyes on a lot of similar campaigns look at your data and figure out what's wrong with it.
Nice. Brandon, again, thank you so much. I would encourage all of you guys to reach out to him, batemancollective.com. If you're running your PPC through somebody else, listen, man, take advantage of this guy's experience and his team and let them run a little audit there and then see if you have any issues or if there's anything that can be tweaked. But for real, this is the guy that runs PPC for a lot of the biggest investors in the country. So highly encourage you to reach out. Brandon, thank you so much, buddy. And I'll be talking to you very soon.
Cool. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody.